Hi everyone and welcome to my Double Swing Barbarian build guide for Diablo 4 Season 3. This is one of the fastest builds in the game for leveling up and speed farming all the way to Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons. This is a build I've already made a guide about and played a lot in Season 2. You might have seen that. The Shoutless Barbarian that has a charge, leap and steel grasp. No shouts involved and it's incredibly fun to play. In fact, this is the build that I'm going to be starting with going into Season 3 to try to race for world first solo hardcore to 100. I think this is that good and probably beats everything you can do on the rogue. So I'm going to walk you through the entire setup. I have updated planners here that I'm going to show you about skills, paragons, items, everything you need to know. And we're gonna have a lot of fun with this. Personally, I'm a big fan of how this build flows with the steel grasp pulling entire packs of monsters to you. As you can see here, it feels extremely satisfying to do that and kind of just mow your way through the pack. And the cool thing about double swing is also that you just proc all of your effects that you need passively by just playing the build. Like berserking is permanently up. You can stun stuff with your hits. It's just like a very simple, straightforward build, and you have a few buttons to just go even faster and have more fun. And on top of this, the boss damage is also really good. So if you're worried about that, yeah, this build doesn't hit in the hundreds of millions like Hoda or something. But you see here, even those T100 bosses are getting decimated with ease. And honestly, this build only got better in Season 2. There were some changes to Barbarians, in particular those key passives here with Unconstrained that we have here. That makes the resource management a lot easier because now you can run Unconstrained instead of Unbridled Rage. That gives you a pretty comparable damage buff. It's a bit less per swing, but you have a way easier resource management. And this actually buffs this build's damage again, because thanks to the Maratni's Magnum Opus, you actually want to have very high resources all the time. And if you ever run low on resources, which is very easy to do with double the cost, it's much harder to sustain. And you actually lose some of your damage benefits by spending so much resources, especially on boss fights, especially when you can't trigger certain like resource recovery effects from kills, for example. That can be a struggle when you lose the other key passive. And now you no longer have to do that and you have a relatively similar damage output. Because Unconstrained, right now it shows 60% is the old data because the patch is not live, but it's actually getting buffed to 100% damage bonus. And then you can take that 100% damage bonus and multiply it by ×2 with Wrath of the Berserker. And then after you have pressed Wrath of the Berserker, you're gonna have this buffed damage bonus the entire time until your Berserking drops, which never happens with this build because you have perpetual berserking uptime. So like this, you actually get a damage output pretty similar to what you can do with Unbridled Rage, or even Unbridled Rage plus Wrath Berserker. And the resource management has just become a lot easier. The build has become a lot more smooth to play, making it a really good starting build to level all the way to 100. And with that, let's jump right in here in the skill tree. So we are sticking to Unconstrained for the entirety of the progression. So you see here, you start with this. Previously, I had this only in the leveling section, and then we switched at some point once the resources were figured out. But that is just no longer necessary, and it just makes the build easier and smoother. So our main core skill here is the Double Swing. This has a nice perk which gives you resources back when you stun enemies. And this is something that this build bangs on quite a bit. So we have a few aspects for that in particular. There's also like a chance to stun enemies, at least early on. You can do that with Concussion, for example, by just using a bludgeoning weapon. So double swing obviously requires one-handed weapons, so one of them needs to be a mace, and then this is considered a skill using bludgeoning weapons, proccing concussion, proccing the Valor damage bonus here. So both of those passives can be activated by just using one mace here. Generally you want to go with a sword, but ultimately, as you level up, you're just going to go with the best weapon you have, but try to make sure you have one mace at least, so you can actually trigger these. Now, later on, there might be some setups like this one, for example, where you actually have two swords because you have this unique, and this is a sword, and then, for example, Doombringer, if you want to go that route as well, and you can't do this, but, you know, once you're like that decked out with Uber-Enix, you also don't have to worry anymore about this little bit of damage down there. One thing that is important for double swing is stunning enemies. So we get this from the Concussion. You can also get it from Ground Stomp. I had this originally in the build, but I figured just putting Wrath of the Berserker in there because of this Unconstrained buff and this kind of like permanent bonus that you get from Path of Berserker with Unconstrained is really powerful. So you rather go for the raw damage output and try to get stuns other ways. For example, here we have the Anemia legendary aspect. That is one of those sources of the stun and the concussion. And like this, they actually have, you know, relatively reliable stuns. There's also the charge in there. So when you charge into enemies, which is, you know, massively buffed as well now, there's actually a kind of sizable damage skill for this build. You can just like, you know, double swing a little bit and then charge into them and, you know, do like some big nuke basically once in a while. And not just use it for mobility, but this also has a built-in stun if you actually knock enemies into a wall, for example. So there are multiple ways of stunning enemies, either passively or actively in this build, that makes this resource management pretty smooth, even starting quite early in the progression. And lastly, here's the permanent berserking that you get from Double Swing. So you just need to activate it somehow, and then you have perpetual berserking as long as you keep attacking something once in a while. So you can do this through the Path of Berserker, you can do this through brawling skills. For example, there's this passive here that is also an activator. As you jump into a pack or charge into a pack, you just get 2 seconds of berserking, and then you start swinging, and it's going to stack up the duration. And also another way that you can use if you want to is the Steel Grasp. So if you feel like sometimes it's dropping off, this is another way to get you berserking. So there are many triggers here, and you just need to activate one of them in a fight, and you're fine. Now for the remaining skills, I've talked about the charge. We also have the leap here. It's mostly just there for extra mobility, to go faster, to make the build feel more fun. You can jump over cliffs and stuff. You can get a bit of resources. That's kind of nice. Steel Grass obviously has great synergy here because with a well-placed Steel Grass, you can pull it like an entire room to you, slice them up in like one hit, and you're gonna save a lot of time, you know, running from enemy to enemy instead. So this is like a staple in Double Swing, I think, and should be here. And then there's the Path of Berserker that I talked about as well. And the rest of the setup here is just passive. So we have movement speed, we have extra damage here, and we have extra life there. Nothing really crazy. So the one thing that is kind of important here is the Wallop. So again, use a mace, use Wallop. Or if you can't use a mace or you want to swap some stuff around a little bit, you can also remove those 3 points later on maybe. Here's extra attack speed, and here's also healing from spending resources. So in general, you try to just spam Double Swing as much as possible. Your objective is that eventually you're going to have so much resources that you just never have to press other buttons really, besides going, you know, like charging into a pack or something. You don't want to use a generator anymore, your basic attack here. It's still on a bar because sometimes you might need resources, and also sometimes it's just useful to jump from enemy to enemy, for example. You can lunge and then swing, and you can just go around faster. But the goal is ultimately that you just never really used lunging strike. And potentially you could even get to the point where you don't even need it on your bar if you want to. And this is achieved by just having a few resource generation rolls. So late game in ancestral tier items, you get resource generation on your rings. It's a very important stat for many builds, including this one. So you want to make sure you get that. And of course, we also have these aspects that I talked about that give you the resource recovery whenever you swing at a stunned or knockdown enemy. So those are the options, and we also have a bunch of resource recovery coming from Paragons and Glyphs in the setup. So here, for example, we have the Seething Glyph that gives you free Fury on Kill. That is pretty useful. And then we also have a bunch of Fury on Kill from Paragon that is down here, so on the Wallbringer board. There's Maximum Fury that synergizes here with Ramadani's Magnum Opus, so this is a very important stat. And here's Fury on Kill, so you get like 4 Fury on Kill, 3 Fury on Kill. So it's quite a lot of Fury on Kill that you just get from like running around. And you also have some of the resource aspects. So here's the Unrelenting Fury that gives you a refund. So whenever you use Double Swing and you kill an enemy, you also get a 30% refund, and the same happens on the boss. So it's much easier to sustain there as well with this aspect. Now in the late game, you have yet another source of resource recovery, which is the Tybalt's Will that I put in this build here as well. Now you do lose a pretty important source of Unstoppable in Season 3 with Metamorphosis dropping out from the vampiric powers, but you can still trigger this pretty reliably with Charge. Charge makes you unstoppable momentarily, so then you get this 4 seconds damage buff, you get this extra resources, so this can help you out as well. But it's also totally fine that once you feel okay with your resources, to just skip this item and just have a defensive item instead, especially if you feel like you might be dying too much in the high Nightmare Dungeon tiers. But overall, this build is still somewhat sturdy, I would say, and you don't really have to worry all that much. Because we also have Tusken of Joritz the Mighty, this one drops from Duriel, both these items actually do. And this is a superb item for this build. So first of all, it has maximum fury, again, synergizing with monotony, and it has lots of really cool stuff. Damage while berserking, attack speed, the aggressive resistance is basically an entire defensive legendary power on the helm here as well. And then you also get this extra damage and fury per second and cooldown. So this entire item is like a powerhouse of crazy good stuff and near Shaco level in power almost. In fact, I've actually done some calculation on that a while ago, and you don't even have to be sad about not having a Shaco, let's say. So while those two uniques are relatively late game, you can acquire the Ramratni's Magnum Opus relatively early already. This one drops from Greek War in World Tier 3 already. So if you want to farm a bit of Living Steel early on, you can try to get it there. But ultimately, I would actually suggest to try to wait until Torment difficulty and then farm a few Living Steels there. Maybe try a few runs on Griwar and try to get a sword. And once you have that, you're going to notice a difference. For the rest of the gear, we are trying to stack up enough armor and damage reduction so that you can actually live without, for example, challenging shout on the bar. So you see there's not really any defenses in here, there's no iron skin or nothing. But it works just fine because, well, you're playing a barb. You have stuff like the extra life here for imposing presence. If you really want, you can also go with some more defensive there, and this just becomes a lot easier. But yeah, you want to have defensive stats on your chest, for example. Make sure you cap resistances over time as you reach like level 70 to level 90 or so. You want to try to have everything maxed out on 70 and something like 10k armor or so. And especially if you want to go higher tier 9 dungeons a bit more. So keep an eye out for that. We also have the disobedience aspect here to help with this, especially for the higher end dungeons. But for like regular leveling, you might not even need this. Other important stats here, double swings, of course, crit and attack speed is really useful. The last stat on the glove is not really all that important. I put lucky hit here because, for example, rocking anemia aspect with a lucky hit here is kind of nice, but this can also be strength or whatever pretty much. Then we have a Ghostwalker aspect, and boots should look like this here, either double or triple resists. I put double and damage reduction while injured just to be more tanky. I like maximum evade charges. I think they are probably the best mod to have here on the boots, but evade cooldown also works. And Ghostwalker just makes you faster. So whenever you activate your charge, for example, you're gonna go faster for a little while. So you always try to like actually charge into a pack, for example, so that you get the resets. For your weapons, you need to know this is double swing build, so you only really care about your one-handed weapons in terms of DPS, and your other two weapons are merely stat sticks. So you don't really care much about, you know, your two-handed weapons DPS. As long as they are ancestral and they have good stats, you're fine. But the stuff you want here is damage while berserking, that also scales multiplicatively with the Paragon nodes, close or core damage or something, and then all stats and strength. So this is just like lots of really good stuff you can get there. Same here and same here. So you want all the same stats on all these weapons. And then here's my Magnum Opus as well. And yeah, maybe stack up a bit more crit chance here, for example, on the rings. Have a bit of life there. Damage while berserking yet again. And an amulet could look like this here. You want a fury cost reduction and movement speed for sure, I would say. And then you can have maybe a bit of a damage passive. You can have damage reduction. You can have cooldown reduction. So there's some options here just to like smooth this out a bit more. And the rest of the aspects are mostly just like a few rather generic damage aspects. Here's the Edge Masters aspect. There's accelerating. There's limitless rage. And we also have berserk ripping here to get some bleeds up for, you know, buffing your character with a few of the bleed synergies. And this is the entire setup. Now, if you don't have those uniques early on, we're also going to replace the helm here so there can be shared misery. You can stun one target and then spread that stun to other targets, making the resource management relatively easy early on already. And here I just put a steadfast berserkers. If you find that one to get a bit of fortify, you can also do something like aspect of might or something. And here we have just rapid, so there's not really like another crazy good offensive aspect. This is something you definitely want to replace early on. This could also be like elements maybe, but yeah. I also have a setup here for the early game, so just with the codex, for example. I'm actually planning to like level this from the start pretty much, and well, not too much changes into the skill tree. So there is like a few differences, like for example, you want to get Furious Impulse and then select one of your two-handed weapons for your charge and your leap, etc., so that you constantly swap between them, and you get a bunch of resources there early on just to make it smoother. That's kind of like the main change here. And you see here I have like a bunch of other powers that you just get from the codex. But a lot of the stuff that I actually described is in there. There's the anemia, we have the shared misery there, we have unrelenting fury. It's like some of the important like resource related aspects are all there. And then as soon as you hit enough materials to actually imprint your items, you can start putting stuff on your rings and amulets and whatever, and it's gonna start feeling pretty smooth. And lastly, for the tier 100 dungeons, so if you want to go all the way to the highest difficulty, there's not really much that I should change. I only just replaced Leap here pretty much, and I take Challenging Shout. So yeah, this is a Shoutless Barb, but Challenging Shout is kind of useful. Just kind of like walk into a room, press a button, and you live easily. So if you want, like you saw this other clip, for example, earlier, I was ranking T100s on hardcore, no problem, without Challenging Shout. So you can do that for sure. But if you want to have it a bit easier, this is another option here. And otherwise, the setup doesn't really change. So it's pretty straightforward. It stays the same. And there's also like one version with Uber Uniques. So once you have acquired those, you start replacing a few of those aspects. Now, a lot of people will ask me, why are there not the twisters in this build? So this is like, there's like two different aspects here. The Dust Devils, I mean. So there's one where you cast Double Swing twice and you get a Dust Devil, and then there's another one where after generating 100 Fury you get a Dust Devil. So both of these things are kind of easy conditions, but I'm just not a fan of these Dust Devils. You can play with them, but I think the investment is just not worth it. And there's also a glyph for it that you have to like accommodate for and all that. And I just feel like it doesn't really work out well enough. I've been looking at footage of trying this out. The amount of hits that you get from the Dust Devils just doesn't seem worth it because you just fly off to nowhere most of the time. So let's jump into the Paragons here as well for a little bit. And this is a pretty straightforward setup. So we have 5 different boards. There are 5 different glyphs. And the Paragon setup also stays exactly the same. And you can kind of just build as you go. Most of the glyphs you can actually like slot in there very easily as you level up, so you don't even have to worry too much about this, you know, leveling to 15 first and then putting them in the right slot. So there may be cases where you maybe have to like, you know, put another placeholder glyph for the start until you get them online or so, but for the most time it just works. So it's pretty straightforward. And the most important Paragon notes that we have here, first of all, is Blood Rage. This gives us the insane damage multiplier for stacking up the damage while berserking. So this is your primary, you know, stat that we have on all these items here, like the weapons, the rings, etc. This is why. We also have Carnage, 16% attack speed, makes it feel real good. We have Warbringer here, so this is quite late. So until then, you might want to try to fortify with an aspect. For example, what I had described here, the Steadfast Berserkers. There are also other aspects you can use until this thing comes online. And then you have all your fortify worries solved. And lastly, we have Decimator here. So there's no real overpower synergies, so this doesn't trigger that often, but you do make enemies vulnerable from time to time, and you can get this effect. And as for the glyphs, speaking of vulnerable, we have the Exploit glyph here. So this is kind of like the synergy with the Decimator, and this gives them a free damage buff every time you engage, and most fights are very short, so they just kind of, this 3 seconds vulnerable is enough most of the time. Then we have Ambidextrous, gives you extra damage for one-handed weapons and some magic buff here, so it's kind of cool. We have the Ire, this is the damage while berserking glyph, very important. So this is something you want to max out pretty early if you can, and put it here. You get up to 75 strength, boosting this like crazy. There's a territorial glyph that gives you damage and damage reduction for close targets. And finally the Sieving here. So you can also try to put Sieving much earlier in the setup if you ever feel like you're struggling for resources, but as long as you have one sword equipped, similar to like having one mace equipped for like the Valor passive, you can get this effect here. So you can also just, you know, if you feel like you're struggling with resources, you just slot this in, maybe like, you know, much earlier here. You can put it here, for example, early on, or even here on the start, and you get this resource on kill. There is also Wrath that you can spec into. This gives you resource on crit. So especially late game, once you have a bit more crit chance, this is also a really good option. And finally, for your construct, I recommend this setup here. So this has Gyrate, or basically any other like attacker of your liking, but I feel this one is kind of cool. There's like a melee AoE whirl. I mean, there's a lot of stuff unknown about these constructs, but it's just what I'm going with. I put a resource support, so you get passive resource recovery all the time. It's kind of nice. You get 15% crit chance here. That's pretty sick. And the initiative, so that the robot just teleports into the pack all the time as you go and actually applies these things here. And I put cooldown here, the flash of adrenaline. We don't know how good that is, but it gives you a damage buff and longer duration, shorter cooldown, damage reduction buff. So just kind of like, you know, a bit of buffing, a bit of resources and crit. I feel like without knowing how good these things actually are in dealing damage, this is a pretty safe option. But again, you can experiment a bit and see what works best for you. And that's it for this guide here. So I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you good luck in Season 3. Personally, I'm very excited to jump in yet again with the Double Swing Barbarian. As I mentioned at the start, this is going to be my racing build, so I'm going to be blasting this like day 1, day 2, etc. Until level 100 and beyond probably, because I just like it so much. It's very fun and fast. So if you want to see this live in action, you can come to my streams here on YouTube or on Twitch. And if you have any kind of questions, of course, I'll be there to answer them as well. So good luck, have fun in Season 3, and I'll see you guys next time.